This is not a Hollywood screenplay. What you are about to witness is a minute-by-minute reconstruction of events salvaged from declassified British MI9 intelligence files and the harrowing memoirs of Oflag XXI-B survivors. This is the story of James "Jimmy" Buckley, a man who transformed the desperate act of escape into a refined art and into his final, silent battle. Part 1. Falling from the Clouds. Why the crash was only the beginning of the nightmare. The cockpit of the ferry Swordfish was a cage of noise, vibrating with the ferocious roar of the Pegasus engine. James "Jimmy" Buckley sat encased in the small space, his gloved hands gripping the control column. Below, the English Channel was a churning sheet of gunmetal gray. The mission was straightforward: reconnaissance over the French coast near Calais, monitoring the relentless German advance. But simplicity in war was a myth. It started with a single, jarring thud that echoed through the aircraft's frame. Buckley's head snapped toward the starboard wing, a neat line of holes stitched across the fabric surface. Flak. The white puffs of anti-aircraft fire blossomed around him, surprisingly silent against the engine's scream. He immediately kicked the rudder pedal, diving the biplane toward the relative safety of the low cloud base. The controls suddenly went heavy. The aircraft bucked violently. Buckley's eyes darted to the instruments. Oil pressure was dropping rapidly. A spray of black fluid erupted from the engine cowling, instantly coating the front perspex windscreen and obscuring the forward view. He threw his arm up, vainly trying to wipe a clear spot through the thick sludge, but the wind smeared it faster than he could fight it. The sound changed. The roar of the engine fractured into a sickening, rhythmic metal-on-metal screech. Smoke, thick and acrid with the smell of burning oil and high-octane fuel, began to fill the cockpit, choking him. The airframe shuddered as if it were trying to shake itself apart. A second set of impacts tore through the fuselage. Bullets whizzed past his helmet, one shattering the instrument panel in a cascade of glass. Buckley didn't think, he reacted. He wrestled with the flight stick, using every ounce of shoulder muscle to keep the nose up. His boots slammed against the rudder pedals, fighting the aircraft's desperate urge to spin. Every tendon in his arms strained as he countered the gravity pulling him down. The channel rushed toward him. Through the side of the cockpit, the horizon was no longer a flat line. It was tilting at a terrifying angle. He was too low for a parachute pull. The water was not soft. At this speed, it was concrete. The impact was a brutal, bone-jarring crash. The Swordfish didn't glide onto the waves. It slammed into the shoreline mud near the rising tide. The wrenching scream of tearing metal was the last thing he heard before the world dissolved into motion and violence. Silence. Then the hiss of steam from the shattered engine. Buckley was thrown forward against his harness, the straps digging deep into his chest. Dazed, he felt the damp chill of the coastal air mixing with the heat of the wreckage. A sharp pain lanced through his shoulder, and he could taste copper in his mouth. He scrambled. The fear of fire was an instinct that overrode all pain. He fumbled with the harness buckle, his fingers numb and trembling. It wouldn't budge. Panic, cold and sharp, began to seep in. The smell of petrol was getting stronger. He yanked again, harder, twisting his body. The metal clicked open. He dragged himself over the edge of the shattered cockpit. His boots hit the soft, sucking mud of the French coast. He staggered away from the smoking pile of canvas and metal that, minutes ago, had been his world. Every step was a battle against vertigo. The shoreline was desolate, the sky a gray, unmoving blanket. He needed cover. Buckley stumbled toward the dunes, his eyes scanning the empty landscape. His body was a map of aches, but the need to move, to put distance between himself and the crash site, was all-consuming. He pushed through the coarse beach grass, the cold wind biting at the sweat on his face. He was in enemy-held territory. He heard it first, not the engine, but the screech of brakes. He flattened himself against the sand behind a scrub bush. Through the blades of grass, he saw a military vehicle pulling up on the coastal road. Not the familiar shape of a British Bedford truck. It was a field gray German Kübelwagen. Two soldiers in field gray uniforms stepped out. Their movements were sharp, efficient. They were looking at the plume of smoke rising from his aircraft. Buckley's chest hammered against the sand. He didn't move. He barely breathed. The soldiers pulled rifles from the vehicle and began to sweep the beach. He watched them advance. He calculated the distance to the edge of the nearest tree line. It was too far. He was exposed, injured, and alone. He tried to shift his weight to prepare for a sprint, but a branch under his chest snapped with a loud, distinct crack. Both soldiers instantly froze. Their heads snapped in his direction. In one synchronized motion, they raised their Kar 98K rifles, racking the bolts. The sound of metal chambering rounds was deafening in the silence. Buckley didn't need to hear their command to stop. Their eyes, visible over the barrels of the guns, told him everything. He stood up slowly. His hands went into the cold air, palms open. The realization hit him with more force than the crash itself. The sky was gone. The movement was gone. The fight, for now, was over. He was a prisoner. Part 2. The geometry of captivity. How a captured pilot turned a prison into a blueprint for escape. The sound of the heavy iron gates slamming shut behind him was final. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock on his life. James Buckley was processed. His name was recorded, his measurements taken, his pilot's wings noted, and then he was pushed into the courtyard of Dulag Luft, the transit camp for captured Allied aircrew. The reality of captivity was a physical weight. The camp was a world defined by geometry and restrictions. Gray barracks were arranged in rigid, efficient lines. The ground was a uniform, packed dirt that turned to slippery mud with the slightest rain. But above all, there was the wire. Two parallel fences, 10 feet high, with coiled concertina wire filling the gap between them. It was a silver scar across the landscape, glittering maliciously in the pale sunlight. Buckley began to pace. It was a habit shared by every man in the camp. Up and down the designated walking path, 10 paces to the corner, 10 paces back. His eyes were not resting on the men around him, nor on the dreary buildings. He was looking at the ground. He was noting the distance between the barracks and the wire. He was timing the searchlight sweeps. He was mapping the camp's vulnerabilities. His pacing drew attention, not from the guards, who were used to the restless energy of captured pilots, but from within the inmate population. A subtle, silent communication was happening. A glance exchanged over a communal water pump. A nod while standing in line for the watery vegetable soup that passed for dinner. He was eventually approached during a solitary walk. No names were given. A fellow prisoner fell into step beside him, matching his rhythm. The conversation was conducted in low, even tones, without the men looking directly at each other, their gaze fixed forward. Buckley was observed. His energy was noted. The subtle question was asked. Was he interested in working? He didn't hesitate. A simple nod was all that was required. Buckley was inducted into the escape network. It was an organization born of desperation and fueled by ingenuity. There were no grand pronouncements, only a shared, desperate focus. He was shown the workshops hidden in plain sight. In the corner of a barracks, a group of men appeared to be mending clothes, but beneath the fabric, they were unraveling woolen sweaters to create strong cord. In another corner, a man was meticulously sharpening a metal spoon against a piece of scavenged granite, turning it into a functional wire cutter. His specific role became intelligence. His daily pacing routine was repurposed. He didn't just count steps anymore. He measured the distance from the outer wire to the nearest ditch. He noted the times of the guard changes and which sentries were diligent and which were lazy. He watched the delivery trucks, noting which ones were searched and which were waved through. He was a human surveyor, mapping the fortress. The preparation work was a test of endurance. Buckley and the others worked under constant threat. A surprise inspection by the guards was a regular occurrence. The shout of a warning, the sound of boots on the barracks floor, and the work had to vanish in seconds. Forged papers were slipped inside the hollow legs of metal bed frames. Maps, drawn on toilet paper with ink made from burnt cork and stolen chemicals, were hidden under loose floorboards. The air would still be thick with tension, their hearts pounding in the silence, but their faces would remain mask-like, innocent. He spent hours hunched over a tiny desk made of stacked crates, lit only by a stolen candle. Buckley was part of a team forging transit documents. He used a needle-sharp point made from a broken sewing needle to meticulously mimic the complex Gothic script of German official stamps. Sweat would bead on his forehead, blurring his vision, but he couldn't stop. A single mistake, a slight deviation in the curve of a letter, could mean discovery for whoever used the paper. His hands, usually so confident on a flight stick, learned a new, delicate precision. But the real work was psychological. The camp was a forge, and they were the steel. It was a process of hardening. The initial shock of capture was replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. The boredom and hunger were channeled into focus. Every minor victory, a stolen map, a forged signature, a new escape route identified, was a shot of adrenaline that fueled the next hours of painstaking, dangerous work. The mood in the camp shifted over the months. The initial despair of defeat was being eroded by a growing sense of quiet defiance. They were no longer victims. They were combatants again, fighting a different kind of war. Buckley felt it. His body was thin, his uniform tattered, but inside, a burning purpose was taking root. He was going home. Part 3. The Price of a Shiver. How one microscopic mistake turned a train ride into a trap. The wire cutters severed the final strand of the perimeter fence with a dull, metallic snap. Rain lashed against the muddy earth, masking the noise. Buckley pressed his body flat against the sodden ground, feeling the freezing water soak through his layers. He pushed himself forward, dragging his torso through the narrow, jagged opening. The metal barbs tore at his stolen civilian jacket, snagging the fabric, but he refused to pause. One final, agonizing pull, and he was through. The soil on the other side felt exactly the same, yet the immediate absence of the towering metal grid completely altered the atmosphere. He was out. He moved instantly, scrambling into the dark tree line before the sweeping beam of the guard tower searchlight could wash over the breach. The forest floor was a treacherous obstacle course of slick roots and hidden ditches. He navigated blindly, guided only by the distant, rhythmic chugging of a locomotive. His forged transit papers, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, pressed heavily against his ribs inside his breast pocket. Reaching the provincial railway station required shedding the posture of a hunted fugitive. Buckley stood in the shadows of a brick siding, forcing his breathing to slow. He adjusted the collar of his heavy, coarse woolen coat, a garment bartered for at a steep price inside the camp. It smelled intensely of damp sheep and stale tobacco. Stepping onto the dimly lit platform, he joined the sparse crowd of local workers and weary travelers. He mimicked their slouched shoulders and exhausted gaits. The train arrived with a deafening hiss of steam and grinding iron. Buckley boarded a third-class carriage, the air inside thick with the suffocating heat of a coal stove and wet wool. He found an empty window seat on a wooden bench and sat down. He crossed his legs, resting his hands loosely on his lap, consciously willing his fingers to remain perfectly still. The train lurched forward, gaining speed toward the Baltic coast. With every mile of track clicking beneath the floorboards, the impossible distance between Captivity and the sea began to shrink. Hours passed in a rigid, agonizing trance. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was hypnotic, lulling the carriage into a drowsy silence. Buckley kept his gaze fixed on the passing dark landscape, tracking the faint reflections of the carriage lights on the glass. Then, the rhythm of the journey shattered. The heavy door at the end of the carriage slid open with a sharp, violent clack. Two figures stepped into the narrow aisle. They wore the unmistakable dark leather trench coats and peaked caps of the state secret police. The atmosphere in the carriage instantly plunged into absolute, terrified stillness. The only sound was the heavy thud of leather boots advancing down the wooden floorboards. Buckley stared straight ahead at the scratched wood of the seat in front of him. A drop of sweat detached from his hairline, tracing a slow, burning path down the side of his neck. He swallowed hard, trying to moisten a throat that had suddenly turned to sandpaper. The boots moved closer, stopping at each row. The rustle of paper, a sharp gesture demanding identification. The quiet return of documents. The boots stopped beside his bench. A black leather glove extended into his peripheral vision, fingers snapping twice in a universally understood demand. Buckley reached inside his jacket. His heart hammered against his ribs with enough force to visibly shake his chest. He retrieved the oilcloth package, unfolded it, and produced the forged transit pass. He extended his hand upward. Despite his supreme mental effort, his fingers betrayed him. A microscopic, rapid tremor vibrated through his hand, causing the stiff paper to rustle ever so slightly against the leather glove. The inspector took the document. The silence stretched into an unbearable eternity. The inspector tilted the paper toward the dim, overhead bulb, examining the ink of the forged official stamp. A thumb rubbed across the texture of the paper. Buckley kept his eyes glued to the inspector's belt buckle, every muscle in his legs coiled tight, preparing for an explosive movement that he knew would be futile in the confined space. The inspector's gaze slowly lowered from the paper to Buckley's face. The document was not returned. Instead, a heavy hand clamped down on Buckley's shoulder with bruising force. A sharp jerk yanked him upward from the wooden bench. The illusion of freedom shattered instantly. Cold steel bracelets snapped around his wrists with a heavy, final click. The journey ended not at the sea, but in the bowels of a local detention center. A heavy iron door swung shut on rusted hinges, slamming against the stone frame with a concussive boom that vibrated through the floor. The deadbolt slid into place with a hollow echo. Part 4. The Coffin Under the Stove, carving a path through 150 feet of suffocating earth. The Polish winter was a physical assault. The transfer to Oflag XXI-B in Shiver stripped away any lingering memories of the relatively organized transit camp. Here the world was entirely composed of two elements: freezing, biting wind and bottomless gray mud. As Buckley marched through the camp gates, his boots sank ankle-deep into the freezing sludge. The cold penetrated his thin uniform instantly, seizing his joints and turning his breath into thick white plumes. This camp was designed to break spirits through sheer environmental brutality. The wooden barracks offered barely any shelter from the howling drafts that swept across the flat, desolate plains. Yet beneath the oppressive despair of the surface, a ferocious, unseen energy vibrated through the captive population. The mud was a curse, but the earth beneath it was a canvas. The project was immensely ambitious, a tunnel stretching 150 feet beyond the wire, carved directly through the dense, unforgiving Polish soil. Buckley's world soon shrank to the dimensions of a coffin. Access to the shaft was concealed beneath a cleverly modified stove in the washroom. Sliding headfirst into the vertical drop, the transition was jarring. The bitter cold of the surface was immediately replaced by a damp, suffocating heat. The smell was overpowering, a thick, loamy mixture of rotting roots, stale sweat, and ancient clay. At the working face of the tunnel, there was absolute darkness, broken only by the feeble, flickering orange glow of a single, fat-fueled wick. Buckley lay on his stomach, his shoulders grazing the timber supports on either side. He gripped a small rusted trowel scavenged from a discarded toolkit. The work was agonizingly slow. He drove the blade into the hard-packed earth, twisting his wrist to loosen the soil, then dragged the debris back past his hips. Oxygen was a precious, dwindling commodity. With every labored pull of his arms, his lungs burned, starved in the stagnant air. Dust coated his throat, making every breath a rasping struggle. He worked in furious, short bursts, racing against the inevitable dizziness that signaled impending blackout. The Earth itself was an active enemy. The tunnel was shored up using wooden planks secretly harvested from the prisoner's own bed frames. As Buckley scraped away another layer of dirt, a terrifying sound echoed through the confined space. A deep, wooden groan. He froze, his trowel hovering in the dark. Above him, the immense weight of the freezing mud and the sentries patrolling the surface pressed down relentlessly. A fine stream of dust cascaded onto the back of his neck. A wooden beam mere inches from his head began to bow, the fibers snapping with sharp, pistol-like cracks. He pressed his palms flat against the tunnel floor, bracing his body, holding his breath until the settling earth finally ceased its deadly shifting. Excavating the dirt was only half the battle. Making it disappear was the true test of endurance. The extracted soil from deep underground was a distinctly different color than the surface mud. Piling it up would instantly trigger an alarm. Buckley climbed back to the surface, his face smeared with clay, his muscles trembling from exhaustion. He retrieved a pair of trousers secretly modified by the camp tailors. Long, narrow fabric pouches had been sewn directly into the inner linings of the legs, securing at the top with a makeshift pin mechanism. He stood in the shadows of the washroom, carefully pouring the fresh, damp earth into the hidden leg pouches until they bulged, adding roughly 20 pounds of dead weight to his lower body. He secured the pins. Stepping out into the freezing courtyard, the performance began. He adopted the necessary posture, a stiff, unnatural gait to accommodate the heavy, swinging loads hidden beneath his uniform. He kept his head down, blending into the miserable, shuffling crowd of prisoners enduring the mandatory exercise period. Approaching a patch of freshly churned surface mud, Buckley scanned the perimeter. A guard in a heavy gray greatcoat was walking the wire, his rifle slung over his shoulder, looking outward. Buckley reached into his pockets, his fingers finding the hidden strings attached to the release pins. A subtle, sharp tug. The pins slipped free. The bottom seams of the internal pouches opened. As he walked, a steady, controlled stream of dark earth spilled out from the cuffs of his trousers, dropping directly onto his boots. He didn't break stride. He kept his hands in his pockets, using the sides of his boots to immediately trample and churn the fresh dirt into the existing grayish slop of the compound, erasing the evidence with every step. The bitter wind whipped across his face, stinging his eyes, but a fierce, stubborn fire burned in his chest. Part 5. 3 seconds of blinding white, the night the earth finally spit him out. Beyond the wire, the night of the breakout arrived completely devoid of fanfare, marked only by a heavy, suffocating tension that settled over the barracks. March winds battered the thin wooden walls of Oflag XXI-B, a relentless howl that served as the perfect acoustic cover. Buckley stood near the washroom entrance, his body rigid, his eyes locked on a predetermined signal, a simple shift of a towel hanging on a peg. The moment the fabric moved, he stepped forward. The entrance to the tunnel, concealed beneath the hollowed-out concrete base of the stove, gaped open like a dark, toothless mouth. Slipping into the opening required a contortionist's grace. He went down head first, his shoulders immediately scraping against the rough, splintered timber supports framing the vertical drop. The transition from the freezing, drafty washroom to the subterranean environment was an instant physical shock. The air down here was thick, motionless, and heavy with the overpowering stench of rotting earth and stale human sweat. It was the smell of a tomb. Reaching the bottom of the shaft, Buckley flattened his body onto his stomach. The tunnel was barely 24 inches wide and 18 inches high. He began the grueling horizontal crawl. The process was entirely mechanical. Reach forward with the arms, dig fingers into the compacted soil, pull the torso forward, push with the toes of the boots, inches at a time. The darkness was absolute, a physical weight pressing against his eyeballs. Roots, sharp and stiff from the winter frost, tore at his clothing and scratched his cheeks. Halfway through the 150-foot passage, the lack of oxygen became a critical threat. Buckley's lungs burned with every labored intake. A heavy, rhythmic throbbing started behind his temples. The walls of the tunnel seemed to vibrate, threatening to close in and crush him under tons of Polish soil. Panic, sharp and primal, clawed at his chest, urging him to thrash, to scramble backward. He forced his eyes shut in the pitch blackness, grinding his teeth together, channeling every ounce of his willpower into the repetitive motion of his arms. Pull, drag, push. The relentless physical routine was the only defense against the crushing psychological terror of premature burial. The upward slope signaled the end of the passage. The air grew perceptibly colder, carrying a faint, metallic taste of snow. Buckley angled his body upward, his hands finding the wooden rungs of the exit shaft. He pushed upward, his shoulders straining. The wooden cover above him, disguised with a layer of frozen mud and grass, resisted his initial push. He braced his boots against the sides of the shaft and drove his back upward with an explosive burst of desperate energy. The crust broke. The heavy covers shifted aside, and the brutal, freezing March wind rushed into the shaft, hitting his face like a physical blow. He scrambled over the edge, pulling himself completely out of the earth. The sudden expansion of space was dizzying. He lay flat on the frozen ground, his chest heaving violently, greedily pulling in the sharp, clean air. He was beyond the wire. The towering silhouette of the camp fence stood 30 yards behind him, a menacing cage now entirely in his rear view. The intoxicating rush of freedom lasted exactly 3 seconds. A high-pitched, mechanical whine sliced through the howling wind. The sweeping arc of the guard tower searchlight, a blinding pillar of intense white energy, snapped across the terrain. It was moving fast, cutting directly toward his position. Buckley slammed his face into the icy mud. He pressed his arms tightly against his sides, flattening himself as much as anatomically possible, trying to merge his silhouette with the subtle unevenness of the frozen field. He stopped breathing. The light hit him. The glare was so intense it penetrated his closed eyelids, painting his vision a burning, bright red. The beam illuminated the individual blades of frost-covered grass inches from his nose, turning them into glowing white needles. The heavy, rhythmic stomping of a sentry's boots echoed from the wooden platform of the nearest tower. The light lingered, a blinding spotlight illuminating his exposed, vulnerable position. The silence in the beam was agonizing. The entire world shrank to the pounding of his own heart against the frozen earth, a drumbeat he felt certain the guards could hear. Then the beam swept past, plunging him back into the terrifying, beautiful darkness. He didn't wait for it to return. He pushed off the ground, an explosive sprint into the tree line, melting into the shadows of the Polish forest. Part 6. Surviving a 200-mile journey through the heart of the occupied continent. The escape from the immediate vicinity of the camp was merely the opening move of a grueling marathon. Buckley was joined in the dense, silent forest by Jorgen Thalbitzer, a Danish fighter pilot whose quiet endurance matched his own. They functioned seamlessly as a single unit, navigating entirely by the stars and a crude, stolen compass. The landscape of Pomerania was an active adversary. Thick, unforgiving forests gave way to freezing, expansive marshlands. They moved exclusively under the cover of darkness, their progress an agonizingly slow, calculated dance. Every step was deliberate, a constant battle to avoid snapping a dry twig or splashing loudly in a hidden puddle. Within the first 48 hours, the soles of their camp-issued boots began to peel away from the leather uppers. The freezing mud seeped in, soaking their wool socks. Buckley's feet transformed into a landscape of broken blisters and raw, inflamed skin. Each step sent a sharp, agonizing jolt up his legs, but the forward momentum never broke. They stuffed their boots with dry pine needles and stolen newspaper, a pathetic barrier against the relentless, wet, and cold. Their diet consisted of rigid, concentrated rations saved from Red Cross parcels, hard chocolate, and densely packed biscuits that felt like gravel against their teeth. They chewed slowly, extracting every possible calorie, washing the dry paste down with freezing water scooped from muddy tire ruts. Their cheekbones hollowed out, their eyes sinking deeper into their skulls, adopting the haunted, feral stare of hunted men. Daylight forced them underground. They sought refuge in the most miserable, overlooked crevices of the landscape. Thick bramble bushes, abandoned, collapsed barns, or deep, icy drainage ditches. During one agonizing afternoon, they lay pressed side by side at the bottom of a steep embankment bordering a provincial highway. A relentless, freezing rain hammered down, turning the ditch into a shallow, running stream. They lay completely motionless, their bodies half submerged in the icy water, pulling their wet collars up over their noses. A low, heavy rumble vibrated through the earth, growing steadily louder. A convoy of German military transport trucks was approaching. The massive tires churned the mud of the road just feet above their heads. The deafening roar of the heavy diesel engines masked the chattering of their teeth. Mud and dirty water, sprayed from the passing wheels, rained down upon their backs. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes hung heavy in the damp air, burning their nostrils. They kept their heads down, completely at the mercy of the convoy's trajectory. A single soldier looking over the edge, a single breakdown forcing a stop, would end the journey instantly. The vibrations slowly faded into the distance, leaving behind only the sound of the falling rain. Buckley slowly lifted his head, exchanging a quick, sharp look with Thalbitzer. Water dripped from their matted hair. Their lips were blue, their limbs shaking violently, but their eyes held a fierce, unyielding light. Every night they survived, every patrol they evaded, every grueling mile they put between themselves and the wire of Oflag XXI-B was an act of profound rebellion. They were starving, freezing, and hunted, but they were moving entirely under their own power. The pain in their legs was immense, but it was the pain of forward motion, tearing through the illusion of their captivity. Navigating a sprawling, open field without any cover required dropping to their stomachs and pulling themselves through the tall, wet grass for hundreds of yards. The friction of the coarse stalks wore through the elbows of their jackets, scraping the skin beneath. When they encountered a barbed wire fence marking a farmer's property, they didn't climb it. They meticulously dug underneath it, taking turns scraping the frozen topsoil with their bare, bleeding hands to avoid leaving snags of fabric on the barbs. Communication between Buckley and Thalbitzer was stripped down to the absolute bare minimum, a language composed entirely of gestures and eye contact. A raised hand meant freeze. A point into the darkness indicated a suspected patrol. A slight nod meant it was time to push through the exhaustion and keep walking. When Thalbitzer stumbled over an unseen root, violently twisting his ankle, he didn't make a sound. He simply rolled onto his side, gripping the joint until the initial shockwave of pain subsided, then pulled himself up using a tree trunk, forcing his weight back onto the injured leg. Buckley offered a firm grip on his shoulder, a physical anchor of support, before turning back to face the darkness. The march resumed. The compass needle, their only true ally, continued to point north. The scent of the distant ocean, imagined or real, pulled them through the blackness. Part 7. One final paddle. Why the cold Baltic Sea was more dangerous than the guards he left behind. The sudden absence of trees signaled the end of the continent. The ground gave way to jagged coastal rocks and coarse gray sand. A sharp, briny wind whipped across the shoreline, carrying the immense, roaring sound of the Baltic Sea. Buckley and Thalbitzer stood at the edge of the water, the darkness of the night seamlessly blending into the black expanse of the ocean. The smell of salt and decaying seaweed was a powerful, intoxicating shock to their senses after weeks of inhaling forest damp and coal smoke. Their objective lay across this formidable barrier, neutral Sweden. Finding transport was a desperate scramble along the desolate Danish coastline. Among the scattered fishing gear and overturned crates of a small, quiet coastal village, they found it. A small, heavy wooden canoe designed for shallow inlets, not the open fury of the Baltic. There was no hesitation. They gripped the heavy wooden gunwales, their muscles, depleted by starvation and weeks of relentless marching, strained under the immense weight. The rough wood dug into their palms as they dragged the vessel across the sharp, uneven stones of the beach. The harsh, scraping sound of the hull against the rocks seemed deafening, a massive risk in the silent night, but speed was essential. They pushed the bow into the churning surf. The freezing water instantly soaked through their boots and trousers, biting into their skin like thousands of icy needles. They scrambled over the side, their weight causing the small craft to rock violently. The vessel rode dangerously low in the water. Buckley took the forward position, Thalbitzer at the stern. They gripped the heavy wooden paddles, the varnish long worn away. They drove the blades down into the black water. The physical demand was entirely different from the long march. It was a relentless, pulling rhythm against an unyielding, massive force. The muscles in their backs and shoulders, already pushed past their limits, screamed in protest with every stroke. The water was not a passive road, it was an aggressive opponent. The tide pulled against them, a heavy, unseen hand trying to drag them back to the occupied shore. They paddled in perfect synchronization. The wooden shafts groaned against the sides of the boat. The dark shore began to slowly, agonizingly recede into the gloom. But the sea was changing. The wind shifted, howling down from the north with renewed, violent intensity. The relatively calm surface of the coastal water began to fracture. Deep swells rose from the darkness, lifting the small wooden boat high into the air before dropping it sickeningly into the troughs. The water turned from a black mirror into a chaotic, churning landscape of whitecaps. A massive wave crashed against the starboard bow. Freezing water poured over the side, instantly filling the bottom of the boat, soaking them to the waist. The temperature of the water was paralyzing, sapping the heat directly from their core. The extra weight of the water made the boat sluggish, violently unresponsive to their frantic paddling. They were caught in the grip of a rising storm. The physical struggle shifted from an attempt to move forward to a desperate fight merely to stay upright. The roar of the wind and the crashing water obliterated all other sounds. The sheer scale of the ocean completely dwarfed their small, wooden vessel. Buckley dug his paddle deep into the face of a rising swell, throwing his entire body weight into the pull to keep the bow pointed into the waves. His arms moved not out of strength, but out of pure mechanical instinct. Every fiber of his being was focused on the next stroke, the next breath, the next immediate second of survival. The darkness surrounding them was total. The coastline was gone. The horizon was gone. There was only the immense, terrifying power of the unforgiving sea and the rhythmic, desperate splashing of two wooden paddles. The small boat rose on the crest of another massive wave, silhouetted for a fraction of a second against the gray foam, before slipping down into the deep, churning valley beyond. The rhythm of the strokes never slowed, a relentless, silent testament to an unbreakable will, as the vast ocean finally swallowed their silhouette, leaving nothing but the roar of the wind and the endless rolling waves. Epilogue. Beyond the reach of the wire, the unbroken legacy of the man who refused to stay captured. The dawn that followed the storm over the Baltic was cold, indifferent, and blindingly bright. The gray, turbulent waters of the previous night had settled into a rhythmic, deceptive calm. The sea, vast and iron-colored, offered no witnesses. There was no wreckage floating on the surface, No splintered wood from a small canoe. No tattered remains of a Royal Navy uniform. The horizon remained an unbroken, mocking line between the water and the sky. The arrival in neutral Sweden, the goal that had fueled every agonizing inch of the 150-foot tunnel and every freezing mile across the Polish plains, never happened. James "Jimmy" Buckley and Jorgen Thalbitzer did not step onto the sandy shores of freedom. They did not feel the warmth of a civilian fireplace or the safety of a world without wire. The ocean, in its immense and ancient power, had claimed the final tax on their bid for liberty. Back in the drafty, mud-soaked barracks of Oflag XXI-B, the vacancy left by Buckley was a physical ache. The guards eventually discovered the tunnel beneath the washroom stove. They poured concrete into the shaft, sealing the dark passage with a heavy, gray finality. They searched the beds, confiscated the forged maps, and increased the patrols. But the damage to the illusion of their control was irreversible. Buckley's name didn't fade into the silence of the casualty lists. It became a low-frequency vibration that hummed through every Allied prison camp in occupied Europe. He was the architect. He was the man who had proven that the earth could be hollowed out with a spoon, that the state's secret police could be fooled with a trembling hand and a forged stamp, and that the wire was only as strong as a prisoner's fear. In a quiet home in England, the official telegram eventually arrived. It was a cold, thin slip of paper, stripped of the sensory chaos of the cockpit or the suffocating heat of the tunnel. It used words like "presumed dead" and "missing at sea." But for those who had worked beside him in the dark, breathing the stale air of the Polish soil, the telegram was wrong. James Buckley was not a victim of the sea. He had ceased to be a prisoner the moment he slid headfirst into the dirt beneath the stove. He had reclaimed his life with every stroke of the paddle against the Baltic swell. He had died not as a captive of the Reich, but as a combatant in the middle of his greatest mission. The swordfish pilot who had once looked down at the English Channel and seen a cage of noise and fire had finally found his peace in the deep. He left behind no grave, only a legacy etched into the hearts of every man who ever looked at a barbed wire fence and began to count the paces of the guard. The fight was over, the tunnel was closed, and the pilot had finally flown beyond the reach of the wire into the infinite, unmapped territory of the free.